Hi guys, welcome back to another video and coming back to a plant video of all things. I know I've been gone for years actually. I'm coming back with a video on plants of all things. I'm still going to be talking about reptiles, amphibians, and anything really that fits my fancy. But I like exotics, right? Exotic things and exotic plants are fit the bill just right. So, what the hell are we going to be talking about? What is this thing? This is a Cephalotus Follicularis, Albany pitcher plant. This is a carnivorous plant endemic to Australia, and you know how much that makes me go. I love me Australian species. This plant is actually this plant evolved convergently with Nepenthes. What does that mean? Nepenthes is the pitcher plant that almost everybody knows about when we're talking about carnivorous plants. Nepenthes is basically these pitcher plants. But a plant evolved convergently. They don't share an evolutionary ancestor with Nepenthes. This means that they're pretty distinct. I think Cephalotus is the only member of its species or in its family. So really cool. So with Nepenthes, all of the leaves basically come down to a pitcher. This one grows a little differently. Nepenthes usually comes into a pitcher, then they grow up with vines. This plant grows a little differently. This plant grows up from the crown. If you don't know, what a crown is, I can kind of show you guys on these pinguicula. The crown is basically the spot where all the other leaves are coming out from. This is a tiny one, but you can kind of see here right in the right smack center. Same thing with the pinguicula. Some leaves are starting to come out of the crown. So these plants grow mostly from the crown. They can also send out runners, but mostly from the crown. And as the plant grows, the roots kind of expand out and they shoot off runners, which is really cool. So it grows from the crown, and from the crown, unlike Nepenthes, they throw off 3 different types of leaves. Got chubby hands. 3 different types of leaves. They throw off these really nice, iconic, majestic, mature pitchers. They also send out these really waxy, thick, photosynthetic leaves. If I didn't know any better, I would probably say that these leaves are more reminiscent of succulents. And this plant also produces these little tiny pitchers here. They're all distinct. These little tiny pitchers, I call immature pitchers. As you can kind of see here on this one, this pitcher here, right smack in the middle, the peristome or the teeth on the bottom lip come up to an ends, right? Like they form like these ridges. It's very different from a quote-unquote mature pitcher that has this very toothy, rough texture, right? This isn't ridged like that. This looks like, actual teeth. So there's a big difference between these 2 types of pitchers. These small ones here, the half-life on these small little tiny pitchers is extremely fast. If you're lucky, they'll stick around for maybe 3-4 weeks, but they will eventually dry out. Much like my Toby over here, that's absolutely covered in them once upon a time. A lot of them are starting to dry out, and that's perfectly fine. The reason for that is that the plant is finally getting enough nutrients, or it's in a good enough spot for it to start producing some mature pitchers or leaves, like this one here. This one isn't throwing out any mature pitchers, it's just throwing out leaves, which is fine. And when you do buy plants like this, the Tobies, like these tobies here that are very beautiful, absolutely covered in these immature pictures. If you see them dry back and die back, it's perfectly normal. As long as you're getting growth from the crown or you're seeing the plant throw off really nice leaves, you should be fine. It's only when the entire plant starts to shrivel up where you kind of have an issue. But if you see a picture dry up here and there and you're seeing growth in other areas, you're fine. So, Cephalotus have been known in the carnivorous plant community to be finicky growing. They die spontaneously. And really, the reason why this plant is probably has such a bad rap is that it's a very tolerant plant, but it's a carnivorous plant at the end of the day. It will spontaneously combust if you don't do what it likes, and if you don't treat it the way it likes, it will let you know, especially, Cephalotus. So this plant can be grown 101 different ways, 1,000 ways really. And because of that, when you go online and you ask for help or you're looking for help, people are going to give you 50 different pieces of advice. Someone's going to tell you to add water, decrease water. Someone else is going to tell you to add more light. Someone's going to tell you that your lights are too bright. You need to hold back on it. Someone else is going to say your humidity is too low. Someone else is going to probably say that your humidity is too high. There is 101 different ways to grow these things, and they're tolerant to all of those ways. But because if you mess up on any one aspect of their care, it's extremely hard to figure out or zone in on what you messed up on, because everybody grows these things differently, right? So let's get down to it. So the substrate for this plant, if most of the time when you buy these plants, you're going to buy them potted. For example, this anthracite, very beautiful plant. This behemoth, these are not cultivar names. These are just kind of lay names that people that gave these lines of plants. I bought these things potted, so they will tell you when you're buying them whether potted or bare root. If you're just getting into Cephalotus, obviously buy potted. It takes out the guesswork out of the soil. If you are going to have to prepare your own soil, maybe for a division, propagation, or you bought your plant bare root, in other words, they're sending you just the plant, no substrate, not potted, just the plant, maybe wrapped in some kind of napkin or paper, or then you're going to need to know how to prepare your soil. The way I prepare my soil is 50% sand, play sand, no beach sand, no fancy sand, just straight up play sand. It's pretty inert. And then 25% perlite. And then the last 25% is going to be your sphagnum peat moss. Now, 50% sand and the 25% perlite is going to help prevent the soil from retaining too much water. The 25% perlite, 25% sphagnum peat moss works extremely well at wicking up and retaining moisture. That 25% goes an extremely long way. So the 50% sand and 25% perlite help drain the soil. Make sure that it's not retaining too much to prevent root rot, because root rot is such a thing. It's pretty prevalent for Cephalotus. So this 50, 25, 25% mixture, I believe, is kind of the standard when people are having issues or they don't know what's going on. Usually people default to this mix because it just works. If you have this mix and you ask people, how to water your plants, they have a very good idea of what to do, or if water is your big issue, because this soil mixture is just really good, has really good drainage, and usually doesn't, cause any problems with the plant's roots. I've seen people use different mixes, of course. I've seen people use 100% sand, 100% sphagnum peat moss, 100% perlite. I've seen people use akadama. I've seen people use clay. I've seen people use 101 different things, like I said before. I've seen people use live long fiber sphagnum moss. I've seen people use, the list goes on. I think the 50-25-25 mix, absolutely perfect. The one thing I do need to tell you, if you're planning to use this soil, you are going to need to flush it. What does that mean? You need to get your soil and, the mix. Usually I make the mix, and then I run a ton of distilled or reverse osmosis water through that soil and let it drain out. The way you can do it is you can grab a big pot, line the bottom with long fiber sphagnum moss, add your mixture on top of the pot, add about, maybe an inch or inch and a half from the top so your water can sit, and you just flush that soil with water. You can use these smaller pots too. And the idea is that in the sand, in the perlite, and in the peat moss or sphagnum peat, there are going to be dissolved solids or soluble solids in that soil. If you leave those there, you're guaranteed to burn the plants of your Cephalotus. So just flush it out. Just keep flushing. You will have to invest on a TDS meter. These plants aren't cheap. Each one of these plants is like $20-$30 on the cheap end. This thing here costs $20. So invest in a good TDS meter. I don't have a particular one. You can order them off Amazon. Get a TDS meter and see where the water that's coming out of the pot, see how much dissolved solids is in it. It needs to be below 50. If you're below 10, that's even better. You have to use reverse osmosis water, distilled water. If your well water or your city water is, well below 50 parts per million, then you can use that stuff too. You just have to make sure that you flush the soil and get all of that dissolved crud out of it. Now, you're going to want to let that soil sit for as long as possible, and then you flush it again. And then you're going to see that the TDS of that water spiked back up. The reason for that is that there's always going to be some solids that will need a little bit of time to dissolve again. It takes a little time for all that salt, for those dissolvable solids to dissolve, right? You can't just, like, for example, if you have a cup of water and you pour a bunch of salt into it, the salt will immediately start dissolving on contact. But, if you leave the salt to sit in the water for a long enough time, all of it is going to dissolve, right? So make sure that you flush your soil several times before you use it. Thank me later. All of my soil I flushed once or twice. I thought it was fine. Pulled one of the pots out. I flushed just to see. And the parts per million were like at 200 for the first flush. It was insane. And then, the second flush, it went back down into like the 20s. It was a crazy number. I pulled like 4 or 5 pots just to verify it. And yeah, you have to flush your soil several times to get all of that crud out. So substrate for me is the biggest thing because I've had the most issues with a substrate. Just make sure you flush and make sure you use the 50-25-25 mix. If you want to use anything else, that's fine. Free country. But if you use the 50-25-25 and you go ask for help on the internet, people are more likely to zone in on what's the issue. So, all right, so substrate. That's what the substrate is. Watering. Watering is the next big thing of the Cephalotus. Cephalotus is a really weird carnivorous plant. Venus flytraps, when there is a high heat, high sun, they like to sit in water. Cephalotus are a little weird. Some people, like I said, Some people absolutely have their cephalotus sitting in water. Other people don't. Honestly, I think it all comes down to your humidity, your substrate that you used, and the amount of heat or sun or the direct heat that the plant gets. So, in my setup that I have them indoors under artificial light. It does not get over 78 degrees here on this rack. No matter what happens year round, it's going to stay around 78 degrees. And during the winter, it will drop, but it won't get hotter. So, what I do is I use reverse osmosis water. I test it up once every week, and stays well below 10 parts per million. Usually it's at 2 or 3 parts per million, which is perfect. These plants can tolerate 50 parts per million. Of course, if you have something like a Venus flytrap or Sarracenia, they might not be as tolerant, but Cephalotus are a little bit more tolerant. So if there is a little bit of buildup, they will let you know before they immediately combust and die, which is nice. So you use 50 parts per million water or less. So reverse osmosis or distilled. In the long run, if you're planning to keep a lot of carnivorous plants, I would say just get an RO system. Produces a lot of water, more than you need, and it's cheaper in the long run, Yeah. So there are 2 different ways you can water these plants. Each comes with its cons and pros. So what I like to do is I like to bottom water. See this tray? There's a bit of scum on top here, but that's for a reason because of these 2 plants right here. I like to tray water. I water the tray. The plant's pot and substrate suck up the water. They wick up the water. The pot gets saturated. They stop wicking, but the feet stay wet. I prefer to do it like this because this way, the plants don't dry out immediately. They stay wet longer. I don't have to come by and water each individual plant. But this water here, if I don't let them dry out, they might be susceptible to root rot. So, which kind of sucks, right? So you're like, well, what's the other way to water? And that is top watering. It's where you get a jerry can or, a watering can, and you sprinkle water on top, and that's how you do it. Perfectly fine. You can have them under with a tray under here just to catch the water, and that benefits the plant by filling up all of the pitchers here. If you're very good with watering from the top, you can get water into all of those pitchers, prevents those pitchers from dying out, drying out, and eventually dying out, which is really cool. Kills 2 birds with 1 stone, right? I mean, you're watering and you're preventing the mature pitchers from dying, but you are encouraging 2 different things. One of them is powdery mildew, which is a type of fungus. Cephalotus are extremely susceptible to this powdery mildew. It looks like little white fuzz. I think this one has some. Check. I've been treating all of my plants for this powdery mildew. I'm not really seeing it. I think you can kind of see it right there. I think this is kind of a little white patch there. That looks like it's dead or dying. I've been treating all of my plants with the fungicide. It's basically a white patch It doesn't kill your plant. It's an eyesore, but it can cause some damage. And if you leave the powdery mildew to its own devices, it will spread and cover your plants and make them look like crap. And then since it spreads by droplets, you're watering from the top. Droplets of water and spores from that powdery mildew very easily spread to the rest of your collection, which is not a good thing, obviously. So then you'll have to fight off powdery mildew. I don't water from the top and I still get it. So just imagine if you do water from the top. Second thing that can happen if you water from the top, crown rot. Same thing as root rot, but from the crown. With root rot, I think it gives you a little bit more time to react. It gives you time to dry out the plant to possibly save it. Crown rot, it's a little different. It's like rotting from your head down versus your legs up, right? If you start rotting from your head, there's no real way to save you. If you start rotting out from your feet, they can chop off your legs and you'll still be alive. Same thing with the cephalotus here. The moment the crown starts to rot, the plant, unless there's like multiple crowns on the plant, that part of the plant is just toast. So I prefer to avoid crown rot at all. This is an old picture here. I need to pull this thing off. Yeah, so I prefer tray watering. The plant stays wet for longer. I just need to make sure they dry out. This particular tray in front of me, there's less plants here, so there's not as much water demand. But the plants in the back, they got filled up at the same time. They're bone dry. Most of the water, if it's not in the tray, it's in the pots. And yeah, these pots are pretty soaked. So, I let the tray stay dry. When I need to water, the thing that cues me in whether or not these things need to be watered again. There's people post hour-long tutorials on how to water these things. The number one way to figure out or know when your cephalotus need to be watered, just poke your finger in the soil. If you feel wetness to your first knuckle, you're good. If you don't, it's time to water. Usually that's enough. Like I said, some people like to give their plants a dry period. Usually when I let all of my pots dry out until my first knuckle. I'll wait about an extra day after that, and then I fill up the tray as much as possible, and then all of the pots just drink up. When the plants, need water, they start looking a little sad. They get like, let's see here, like here, this particular picture with its lid down, it looks kind of droopy, kind of sad. But then when you water them up, the pitcher lids open up wide, like this guy here. Really cool. So watering, if you don't know how much to water, when to water, just poke your finger into the substrate. If you feel wetness, you're good. If you're not, water. Easy, super simple. With me, because I grow so many, usually I just have to fill up one to know when the rest of them need to be watered. Now, if you're growing your plants, my standard mix here is the 50-25-25 mix. But that's not true for all of my plants. For example, this anthracite and behemoth, this Charles Brewer, this Vera black coal mine beach, Vera from California Carnivores, this Atlanta Botanical Garden clone, and then the Martin Stockel in the back here, the Broke Inlet. All of these plants are grown in different substrate. I need to be mindful of those in particular because they will dry out either faster or slower. If they're drying out slower, maybe I want to pull all of these out and have them dry out for a little longer than the rest of the mine that I've potted up in my mix, because they are retaining water a lot longer. So I want to make sure that my plants dry out for a little bit to prevent root rot, because I tray water. That's something that you have to, gonna have to do. So watering, not really complicated. Just make, if you're not growing that many plants, you're only growing a couple, stick your finger into the substrate. Super easy. All right. Next thing, light. These plants can grow pretty much under low light, I think. But the plant is not going to look as good as if you're giving it a lot of light. I've seen some people I have 3 light fixtures on this one rack or this one shelf. I have 2 double LED bars and 1 shop light. Shop light produces a lot of white light, full spectrum, and the 6 LEDs, they produce a lot of red, blue, purple light, which is really good for growth. I've seen people use a lot less. I've seen people just use shop lights. Perfectly fine. The plant will grow just fine. It will grow probably fantastically well. But if you're in the Cephalotus Club or if you know anything about these plants, the more light you give this plant, the darker and darker their pictures will get. And the really dark pictures are something that, in the community is really liked. Now, if you like, really nice, beautiful green pictures, I'm trying to find, maybe some here, like this DeFlora Giant. You see these really green pictures, and that's more your speed. That's perfectly fine. You don't have to give them this much light, but if you want them to color up nicely, then I recommend, more light. If you want to grow this plant on a windowsill, you can, but I would discourage it. If you are going to grow these things on the windowsill and you're dead set on it, I would encourage you to buy a full spectrum bulb and supplement your plant for around 4 hours, so your plant can actually grow well. Like I said, it's a carnivorous plant. It uses insects to supplement its growth. But these are plants. They need sun. Okay, this isn't a reptile. This isn't an amphibian. This is a plant. It needs light. Like I said, it can grow under quote unquote low levels of light. But at a windowsill, that's just the windowsill situation is going to vary widely from person to person, right? So some people might have a window where they get full blast sun for 8, 9, 10 hours a day. Other people might have just an inkling of full, maybe an hour or 2 of actual good strong light, and then the rest just it's not as good. So I would recommend getting a full spectrum bulb to supplement it for at least 4 hours if you're planning on growing these plants in a windowsill. If your plant isn't getting enough light, usually your plant will stop producing pictures and it will turn into like this big pot of just leaves. That's your Cephalotus telling you that it needs more light. That's basically it. Tons of leaves, and then maybe the leaves might not be like really nice colored up green. Might be like this anemic yellowish coloration. That's when you need to up your light. Lighting is pretty good. Substrate, water, the 3 main components to regular plants. Now let's go into feeding. Cephalotus, you can feed these plants. What I feed these plants is the normal Maxi 1616. I actually have it right here. 1616. So what you do is you grab a maybe 1/4 tablespoon, put it into a jug of water. My jug's here. This is actually, I need to mix some more. Mix a 1/4 tablespoon into one of these jugs. I actually measured the TDS. It was right around 250. And I use this stuff and I pipette as much as the pitcher can hold into each pitcher. right? So here's actually the things I use, my two pipettes. This is my larger pipette. This is a 3 milliliter pipette, I think. And I use this one to feed these much larger traps. So I just go in and I squeeze, and then it gets filled up, and I stop. Then I can move on to the next one, do the same thing. Really, really straightforward. I like using Maxi and this homogenized fertilizer more than, let's say, insects, simply because it's homogenized. It won't rot inside of the pitcher. I can, provide consistency. If I keep, quarter tablespoon to gallon of water, the plant's going to get that. It's going to, it's going to get a stable staple of nutrients. Now, if you use something like bugs, like crickets, roaches, um, you know, the nutritional value might vary from insect to insect. So I want to keep these things as straightforward as possible. And let's be honest, that container of fertilizer I just showed you, it's a lot of fertilizer. It's going to last me, a quarter tablespoon to a gallon of water. The gallon of water probably will last you 3 or 4 months. That container of fertilizer is going to last you years. So pretty convenient. But you can use bugs if you want. If you're going to feed your plants, you got to be very careful. There is such a thing as overfeeding a pitcher. If you feed a particular pitcher too much, the plant will obtain nutrients from the food you're giving it, but once the plant decides enough is enough, they will cut flow. They will cut the pitcher from circulation. Basically, it's aborting that pitcher, and that pitcher will dry up and die. Well, it's a good thing that you got a lot of nutrition into the plant, which is what you're trying to do. The cephalotus grows exceedingly slow. If you are getting a mature pitcher, you gotta baby it if your plant is really small. For example, my UC Davis here, it has 2 adult pitchers. Imagine if I went in and I overstuffed them, then really the only avenue of me giving them, this fertilizer would be cut off, and so it would start growing even slower, right? These small little plants are kind of a headache because they don't have mature pitchers for me to feed, and so when they finally produce the mature pitcher, I don't want to immediately burn it with fertilizer or feeding. I'd rather have that pitcher around for longer and just feed it once a week. And that's what I do. So from this 250 parts per million solution, I feed these plants once a week into every mature pitcher. This helps me, one, of course, feed the plant, and two, keep the pitchers hydrated. If you pitchers won't shrivel up and die if they have water inside of their pitchers. These pitchers here, a lot of these pitchers that are dying on these plants, in the front, really nice, large, beautiful plants, is the reason why they're dying off is because these plants were recently shipped, and most likely those pitchers were damaged during transport. They're damaged. A lot of them have their cell walls or the pitcher compromised, and they actually bleed out whatever I put into the pitcher. So they dry out because they can't hold liquid anymore, which is fair. So I'm going to go in and take out all these old pitchers here. Yeah, so like I said, I go in with a nutrient solution and into every mature pitcher. Even if the pitcher looks like it's drying up, I still throw food in there in the hopes that the plant can still get some food from it. I've gone up as high as 250 parts per million for my fertilizer fluid. I'm not too sure how high you can go until it starts producing problems. I stay at 250 because it's safe. I haven't burned any of my pitchers at 250. So I wouldn't stay at 250 is fine. Maybe I will, eventually make a test plant to see how high I can go before I burn a pitcher. But 250 is a good place to be. Let's say you're feeding insects, crickets, roaches, like I said before. If you give too large of a prey item, it takes a while for these pitchers to digest anything, and those things can rot inside of the pitcher, causing mold and fungus, and that can also kill your pitcher. If you feed your plants fish food like fish flakes or bait, fish flakes mostly, you run into the same risk of molding up the inside of the pitcher and having the pitcher die from it. I've seen people have a lot better results with beta fish food. The little tiny pellets for fighting fish or betas. I've seen people have a lot more luck with those. But like I said, why struggle if you can just use homogenized fertilizer? It's perfect, right? I've also seen, however, some people suggest in the wild the cephalotus are extremely efficient at trapping and eating ants. Some people have actually even passed around the idea that these plants are susceptible to powdery mildew in captivity because these plants aren't eating ants. They're not digesting ants. They're not taking in maybe the formic acid inside of ants, and that has left them vulnerable to powdery mildew. So maybe I would actually be really curious to see if ants can actually hold off powdery mildew for cephalotus. That's a really cool experiment. Maybe I'll try later. But feeding, fairly straightforward. I do it once a week. I think that's a good balance. I've seen people also use Osmocote pellets. Osmocote is basically a fertilizer, almost like a homogenized fertilizer. Come in little pellet forms. I do not believe that you should be giving your cephalotus undiluted fertilizer pellets. That, I think, is a great way to burn your plant. I've seen tons of people do that, and almost all of the time I've seen them get a little too greedy and use too big of a pellet for too small of a pitcher, or too many pellets instead of a big pitcher, and then have the plant basically abort the pitcher. Okay? Slow and steady, man. Slow and steady. If you buy a big plant like this, or there's a bunch of pitchers that you can experiment with, maybe. But I like seeing my plants beautiful. Don't push your plants like that. You can. I mean, we live in America, but it's a great way. If you do it and then you go online looking for help, people are gonna be like, don't do that. All right, feeding, light, water, temperature. These plants do very well indoors. They handle temperatures from as high as like 83, and they do very well in the higher 70s. If you live somewhere where it gets really cold and snow outside, I've actually seen some people grow these things outside. These plants are not frost resistant. If there is frost, that's almost guaranteed to kill these plants. So don't leave them outside if it's frosting over. If it's not below freezing and it snows and you want to keep these plants outside, what you can do is have your plant in a very large pot, because the soil will act like insulation. and then have if it snows, you can actually gather some snow, put it on top of your cephalotus, and that snow will act like an insulator. So if you have heavier snow that night, or that day, your plant should be okay. It's only the frost; it will freeze over and it will die. But I've seen tons of people, use snow itself like an insulator. If you're growing these things outside, it's going to be a completely different hassle. I grow mine indoors. There's no real risk of pests in here because of quarantine, and I make sure that no stuff gets in here really. Powdery mildew is kind of like a different story because there's spores. So if one spore managed to get in, it kind of ruins it. But these are spores we're talking about, so it's extremely hard. I digress. I'm growing mine under pretty controlled, pretty stable conditions. If you're planning to grow yours outside, you need to take steps to acclimate your plant. If you're planning to get a plant like one of these outside, I would first put these plants, an indoor plant, under shade and only give it a couple of hours of full sun, and then bringing it back to the shade until the plant has been fully acclimated to full sun. I would also encourage you to not use the 50-25-25 mix because you are going to have these plants outside. It's not going to be as humid most likely, or you're going to have that sun heat evaporate the water. So I would actually encourage you to have your plant continuously sitting in water and not let the tray dry out. So, and on top of that, you're running the risks of having pests and other things kind of sneak their way into the plant, like aphids, and I'll talk about pests in a little bit. If you're planning to grow your plant outside, though, you get the benefit of growing these things under full sun, and that's when they get really, really dark black red. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful specimens. But because I want to grow mine under more controlled conditions and not let, things kind of run amok, I kind of have to supplement with all of this light. And, if you're, like I said, growing these things out where it's extremely hot, a lot of sun, want to make sure that they don't dry out. If you're growing these in the winter or somewhere where it's just really cold, that's fine. Just like I said, prevent frost. If it's going to frost over, bring them inside. Or if it's going to snow, that's fine. Just make sure that the layer of snow is maintained on top of the cephalotus for the insulation. Which, So, yeah. Let's go into pests. I brought it up. There are various types of pests that kind of bother cephalotus. One of them is aphids, little tiny bugs that kind of latch onto the plant, and they're kind of real easy to see because you're not really trying to hide. They kind of hang around in the crown and the stems of the pitchers and leaves, and they basically just suck the sweet sap out of the plant, and they cause superficial damage. And if you let the aphids stick around for long enough, they can definitely crash your plant. Aphids, though, fairly easy to treat. You can use a thing like neem oil. Neem oil is very effective. I've seen other people use specific insecticides for it, but neem oil works extremely well, and the cephalotus tolerate it very well. Next up are spider mites. Spider mites basically are mites that basically produce webs or webbing. Usually you can really see on the cephalotus itself when you're kind of zooming in on them. You'll see like this matrix of webs on the surface of your pitchers and leaves, and maybe even between the pitchers and stuff. you might have spider mites if you start seeing those things. Again, you can use neem oil. The neem oil works extremely well, but the neem oil works by suffocating the mites and the aphids. So you want extremely good coverage. So you're going to have to use a lot of it to treat a plant. Another thing that bothers Cephalotus is moss. Even though this moss looks really nice, oh, it looks so pretty. It retards the growth of the Cephalotus, unfortunately. So it just crowds the plant. Like here, it's kind of getting buried. Kind of chokes out the crown. So what I do is I usually just dig around. I leave most of the moss there because it's attached to a lot of the soil and I don't want to replace it. I'm lazy. So I just dig around the plants and remove as much moss as I can with some forceps. This moss will grow and it will take over. And really, most people don't care. I do. It does make a difference. If the moss isn't there, the plant grows faster, better. If the moss is there, your plant kind of just slows down. The reason why I haven't done it to this plant yet, this coal mine beech, is because this is a fairly new plant and you need to leave fairly new plants alone. You can kind of see I did it here with my Elizabeth in the back, kind of giving it some space to breathe. Moss won't kill your plant. It will retard the growth, though. Something to be on the lookout for. If you have a ton of moss and your plants just aren't growing, that might be the reason why. Alrighty, and then really the last bug that can probably really wipe out your Cephalotus is a bug called root mealybug, RMB. So root mealybug is extremely insidious because you might see it on the surface or they might be under the soil, attached to the rhizome and roots of your plant. They work in the same way as aphids do, and that they suck out the sweet sap from the plant, causing your plant to fall into a deficit and crash eventually. The only thing is that because the root mealybug is in the soil, it's extremely hard to kill these things. You can use a systemic insecticide. What that means is that the insecticide gets inside of the plant into the cellular tissue of the plant. And so cellular tissue throughout the plant. And so when the root mealybug or aphids drink that sap contains that insecticide. And the root mealybug or aphid ingests it and then they die from it. These plants do not like being treated with systemic insecticides. They will dry up. They do not like it. Cephalotus in general, I've seen people say they've had good luck with certain brands. Cephalotus in general, for systemic insecticides, they do not like it. I've seen some people try to use elemental sulfur. I've never tried it because, knock on wood, I haven't had to. But elemental sulfur, again, will also retard the growth of your plant, not to the same extent as the systemic insecticides, but it will help stave off like root mealybug and aphids if you're growing these things outside. If you're growing these things inside, like I am, the best thing you can do is quarantine and pre-treat any of your plants coming into your collection, right? All of the plants I kind of introduced earlier that are in different potting medias have all been basically under observation for around 2 weeks. I've pre-treated with different fungicides and insecticides just to make sure that they're clean coming in. That way I don't have to treat them. I'd rather treat a plant or two rather than my whole damn shelf, right? So root mealybug is kind of the devil in the hobby of Cephalotus. They will wipe out your plant. Absolutely. And then, they taint the soil, so you can't keep the soil. You'll have to toss it. Yeah, so it's definitely a bastard of a disease. And last but not least, the powdery mildew. Powdery mildew is a type of fungus. Like I said before, it's you'll see it patches, blotches of your plant, and that's why it's so important to kind of look your plant over. Oh, see, like right there. This isn't an active spot like I call it, but this white blotch is evidence that this plant is positive for powdery mildew. Now, this fungus doesn't just grow on the surface, so if you come in and rub it off with isopropyl alcohol, which some people do, guess what? The fungus is still inside of your plant. It's still inside your plant's tissues. So you have to treat your plant systemically. Thankfully, there are systemic fungicides that that Cephalotus really doesn't care about. You can use them, and I have not seen any type of ill effect. What I use is this stuff. Sorry, I'm trying one-handed here. With the active ingredient, I can't pronounce it. Propiconazole. I don't know. It's a type of antifungal. It's used to treat powdery mildew and a bunch of other crap. Powdery mildew, though, this thing is extremely effective on the Cephalotus. I think I treated these plants, yesterday. That spot there, the spot I just showed you here, was like white, fuzzy, and it looked active, Now, after a day, it's dried up. You would be hard pressed to say it's there, like I said. I treat these plants about once a week with that fungicide. That's just to keep it on the down low. It's extremely difficult for me to wipe it out because, like I said, these fungus grows from spores, and the spores are extremely resilient. So I just go in and treat all of my plants about once a week with it. A little bit also goes a long way, so it's not really expensive to treat. So really that's the generalized care, from the watering to the feeding to the substrate to the lighting, maybe even the humidity. These plants can tolerate pretty low humidity into the 40s. They can tolerate high humidity into like the 90s. Humidity only plays a part when you're buying the plant from, like, say, somebody that owns a greenhouse. If your plant's coming from a greenhouse into your grow up setup, and the humidity in your setup is around like 40 or 50 compared to the greenhouse 90 to 100%, your plant's going to suffer. It's going to look like crap. That's what happened with these two large plants here. I think wherever these two plants came from, this anthracite and behemoth, I think these two plants were grown in a place with much higher humidity. So these two plants ended up drying out pretty darn bad. I've lost a lot of really nice looking pictures, I think, because of the difference in humidity. That's probably why I lost this picture right here, because my setup just isn't humid enough for these plants. The cool part is that given enough time, these plants will acclimate. They're already growing. They're already replacing the lost pictures. But you got to give time for your plants to acclimate. If you're buying a small plant, for example, a very small plant like this ABG, and they're coming from a greenhouse, you're going to want to meet your plant halfway. What you do is basically, I have actually some bags up here. You grab your pot and you put it in a large Ziploc bag like this, and then every week, for about a week, you open up the zipper more and more, exposing your plant to your ambient humidity. This helps your plant get time to acclimate to your humidity. Usually I kind of got a rough idea of the humidity that the plant is used to just based on their substrate. If you bought a plant and like this Charles Brewer, and it has like live sphagnum moss. Live sphagnum moss wants high humidity, high light, which is perfect if you have a greenhouse, but my setup isn't a greenhouse, so I know immediately this plant is used to high humidity and I need to bag it. It's a good idea to contact whoever you're buying your Cephalotus from, what their growing conditions are, so you can meet them and then give your plant some time to acclimate to your conditions, right? Imagine if you buy a plant from a greenhouse with extremely high humidity, extremely high light, and your plan is to put the pot in front of a window, not supplement the lighting, not supplement the humidity. What's going to happen? Your plant is immediately going to shrivel up and die. So what you can do, you bag it, you put it in front of the window, and you put that supplemental light to 4 hours at the end of every day, or 4 hours before the sun rises. That's what you got to do for these plants if you're buying them, and if you're buying smaller plants and you don't know the seller, you don't know how the plants are grown, ask and meet your plant halfway. These plants aren't cheap. You can at least make that little bit of effort to make sure your plant gets properly established. Now, you can not do those things, and your plant will most likely acclimate, but it's going to take much longer. I'm talking about months, man. It's going to take a long time for your plants to acclimate. And before it acclimates, you might think the plant's dead. Okay? So, meet your plant halfway. So my setup and overall is pretty low humidity, but the one thing that is not true is, that doesn't apply to are my propagations. I actually have two here. Charles Red here, really nice. It struck finally. This thing struck after 3 months. I've seen people get strikes after 6 months, which is crazy. So 100% humidity, 100% pure sphagnum peat moss. It works. I have another one going over here. That was a leaf. This is a pitcher. I haven't seen the pitcher have any strikes yet. But the pitcher's staying green. And yeah, it's doing well. These two were accidental pulls when I was repotting things, so I wasn't really trying to propagate, but a strike is a strike. Yeah, so 100% humidity when you're trying to propagate. Leaves, divisions, anything really, you give them as much humidity as you can until you see some good growth, and then you can lay off the humidity a little bit. Alrighty, last thing really is propagation. Now, propagation is probably really important because if you like Cephalotus, you want to make more of it. And, maybe just like me, I want to have, experiment with the care a little bit, maybe with how much I fertilize, what I fertilize. For those type of things, having divisions or propagating is a good idea. So, Cephalotus can be propagated in two different ways. One of them is flowering. The Cephalotus can flower. It produces like a very tall flower stalk. It's like 2 feet tall. Really, really nice. Really large flower stalk. And at the end, there's just like a little bud of flowers. Flowers are very plain. You can self-pollinate, but, most people use the flowers to cross either of the plant itself, self-pollinate, or you can create some pretty cool crosses. I don't want to produce any crosses. I'd rather just propagate through divisions. That doesn't mean I don't like crosses. For example, this anthracite is a coal mine beech and OG black. And the behemoth in the back here is a UC Davis and OG black. I like crosses. It's just I don't want to produce them myself. If you don't know, cephalotus grow extremely slowly. I'm pretty sure I've mentioned it before. And to get a plant of substantial size from seed is a feat. It is really an achievement. I don't want to go through all that damn trouble, okay? I'd rather just make divisions, and the divisions just start and go a lot faster than seed. But I've seen people, use seed to basically have these gigantic trays full of cephalotus seedlings. You can make hundreds, thousands of plants, individual plants, through seed. So each one has its pros and cons. Seed takes forever, but you produce a ton of seedlings. Divisions, they grow much faster. They establish a little faster. But you can only make so many of them because you have to pull leaves or pitchers to get them started. I've had more luck getting strikes from leaves than pitchers so far. Yeah, but people they have luck with either, really. It's a 50-50. It's whatever, your dice of the roll is. Yeah. So, when, back to the powdery mildew, if you do have powdery mildew in your collection and your cephalotus starts to flower, the first thing that's going to attract that powdery mildew, it's going to be that large flower stalk. And that's kind of dangerous because if that powdery mildew is on that long stalk, very easily that powdery mildew can spread to the rest of your collection, right? So, yeah. So divisions, propagation, divisions or seed. I prefer divisions, make exact clones. And for some of these plants, for example, the broke inlet in the back there, it's a locale specific plant. It comes from the broke inlet in Australia. There's another plant here. There's in the very back here. That's Emu Point. Again, another locality. This Coal Mine Beach, another locality. So I would rather not cross them in my collection, and I would just make divisions of the localities. Yeah, after all the divisions, you produce exact clones, not when you're crossing. Sorry for my stuffy nose here. Yeah, so pretty good. Yeah, that's pretty much the care. It's an hour-long video, but honestly, this plant deserves it. I've seen too many people kind of gloss over some things, and these things are important. Alright, really now, I'll end this video with some tips and tricks. If you are planning to get your cephalotus, always get it potted. There's only one time I've seen that the plant wasn't offered potted. It was with my UC Davis, and that's because it was a fresh division. The person I bought it from actually just divided their plant, and they didn't want to repot it. They just wanted to send out the division. So I got it bare root. If you're getting into cephalotus and you don't know what you're doing, always get your plants potted. I would recommend tip number 2. Tip number 1, get your plants potted. If you can't, then you're going to, have to suffer through it. It takes a long time for the plants to establish themselves if you get them bare root. It sucks, but yeah. Tip 1, get your plants potted. Tip number 2, start off with a typical. All of the plants here are actually quote unquote unique. They all have different names, like the anthracites across, behemoth, ABG, Atlanta Botanical Garden clone, the Elizabeth clone, Borneo Exotic clone, Charles Brewer, Coal Mine Beach, quote unquote Vera, UC Cephalotus, Charles Brewer's Red, That's a typical back there. Another UC Davis, Thomas Caro, Brewer's Giant, another Borneo Exotic, Czech Giant, Big Boy, Bubble Giant. All of these things have different names, and really you can be attracted to different ones. But understand that they're going to be pricey. And if you're new to Cephalotus, these plants are so small and so attractive that if you get, like a typical here, this is quote unquote typical, the cheapest of the bunch. It's a very beautiful plant. It is probably one of the most beautiful plants I have. It's a very beautiful lime dark green. It's fantastic. And really, this isn't much of an eyesore, Get yourself a typical, test it out, see how your growing setup looks like. You don't need to buy, some expensive clones of plants. Start off with your $30 typical. If it's doing great, if it's growing, if it's fantastic, that's, spread your interest around, look for some other stuff. Next up, so start with typical. If you like your typical and it's doing well, you move on to different stuff. Tip number 3. When you're buying your plants online from California Carnivores, Little Predators is one I've bought from. Rainbow, I forget the name of that website. Rainbow plants. I don't know. I forget. Understand the plants you're going to be buying are small. Cephalotus in general are very small plants. This ABG, very tiny plant. Vera, very tiny plant. The Elizabeth in the back, they're all typical of what you would buy. The ABG and Vera, I think, run for like $30-$40, and they are extremely small. Here's my fingernail. They're small. If you're planning on buying larger plants like this anthracite or behemoth, you're gonna pay a premium, right? Some people would rather pay a premium to get a much larger plant. That's fine. Honestly, I think that there's a website called Cephalotus. They're the guy that, he solves mostly crosses. I think for the price that you're getting these plants, it's an absolute bargain, because these plants are really too large for the pot. So I'm gonna repot these 2 plants, and really from a plant this large, I'm gonna be getting a bunch of pullings, because things are just gonna break while I'm try to take the thing out of the pot. Tons of pullings, tons of divisions. This one plant will probably produce 5 or 6 other plants. And I think it got this behemoth, I think, for like $180, which is a lot for a plant. It's a lot for what it is. But this thing has so many divisions. It's so large. I mean, this plant is probably has 3 or 4 years of growth from the seed. And when it came in, it looked absolutely spectacular. It was grown in basically optimized conditions for it. So I think that it's definitely worth it. But why buy a beautiful plant like this if it's going to immediately crash? Start off with your typical, okay? And then if your typical is doing well in your grow setup, then you can, buy something like this. Right, so if you are planning to get, if you find a rare cultivar or whatever online, and they can only ship it bare root, it's going to take forever for it to grow, but it will eventually grow if you do a good enough job. My Charles Brewer's Red back here, This is basically what it looked like for like 4 months. Ignore the growth here. That's what it looked like. It looked dried, dead, and then maybe 2-3 weeks later, boom, it's giving me growth. And as you can kind of see, the growth is kind of lopsided like this. That tells me that the sorry for the sound, sorry for the grating. Another little growth here. That tells me that the rhizome that was buried shot out a runner, which is fantastic. And again, even though these pictures look dried and ugly, I've still fertilized them and been feeding them through the pitcher every week, and absolutely fantastic. The trick with Cephalotus is pretending not to care. These plants can taste your anxiety. They can taste your fear, and they will let you know. They will just spontaneously combust just to piss you off. You'll, nurse them back to health, and then they'll do it again just to piss you off. These plants are extremely slow growing, so take your time, okay? Don't be in a rush with these plants. I've seen, people with extremely large collections, that's cool. But if you're planning to get into these plants, take it nice and slow. I like buying these smaller plants because eventually, like this purple black, you'll be there for the first adult pitcher, and then you start seeing all these little mature pitchers budding off, and you start seeing the growth you really want to see. Like this UC Davis looked extremely miserable. It looked like crap. I actually burned these 2 UC Davis clones with soil because I forgot to flush the soil, and they got burned up pretty bad. I honestly thought I'd killed the plant because there was no green, and there was only like maybe 1 leaf. I think this 1 leaf here. That was probably what the grower used to strike the plant. That just 1 leaf, and everything else was drying up and dying. I flushed, I gave them stable conditions, and then boom. This plant probably took me 8 to 9 months to get back. It went from looking like this guy in the back here. Ignore the, the foliage and stuff growing in between. To looking like this. Right? I mean, this plant just grows so slowly. So Cephalotus Follicularis, beautiful plant. I went over really. It's an hour-long video. I hope you guys stuck around for my rambling, but it is what it is, man. This plant is just so niche. It needs the attention. All right. So I'll talk to you guys later.